Hello and welcome back to another episode of Raw and Real with Stephanie Fernandez. I'm super excited today to talk to Samantha Goldman about all things food, all things meal times. And if you're a mom like me of small kids, especially small kids, sometimes it just freaks you out. Hi, Samantha, and welcome to the show today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I love all things food, so I'm always excited to talk about it.
Yeah. It's actually funny because I'm a huge foodie and my oldest just loves food and tries everything. And the youngest, he's 3, he goes like, I think he has 5 things he likes to eat. And it's a conscious decision, which makes it even harder for me to like just eat. I know you eat that in school, in preschool, you eat it. I know it. I know you do. I know you can, but he just wouldn't eat it. So tell me how um if you work with parents and they come to you and say, how can I make my kid eat more things and a different variety of things, what is your approach?
Yeah, so even just the way you started, I would say parents come in usually and they're like, I can count on my hand how many foods they eat. That is what they always say. There's like 5 foods. It's like chicken nuggets, crackers, and they count them out. And so I think that was like that hit the nail on the head. That is the conversation I have with everybody. So I would say my approach is a very gentle approach. And that's really kind of important to me because I base it off research and I base it off my personal experience. So when a parent comes in and they say, what do I do? Well, my first question for them is, well, what are you doing? So we first need to look at what's going on. What are you doing? And what is your child doing? So it's not really a one size fits all approach. It really depends on how your kid is doing at the table, what's happening at the table, what does mealtime look like? So a parent who is fighting and actively fighting with their child every meal, I'm going to do something different with them than I'm going to do with a parent who isn't fighting with their child, but they're just kind of not eating anything new.
Mm. Yeah, so there you would say that how the parent approaches mealtime has an impact on the child.
So I want to backtrack here because what I should say first is that I never believe, and this is my personal belief, that any parent is the cause of their child's eating challenges. And I think it's really important for parents to hear that because almost every single parent I've ever spoken to has started their conversation with me and said, it's probably my fault because it's my fault because I pressured them too much. It's my fault because I didn't pressure them enough. My fault because I had this medical concern. And so for all the parents out there, I really want you guys to hear it's not your fault. Usually there's something else going on inside your child's body that's telling them they are not ready. And the things parents have done is their way of coping with it and their way of trying to help. Now, that said, the things we do to try and help, there are things that help more than others, and there are things that hold kids back more than others.
I love how you just enlightened me. So it's not our fault as parents of what's going on, but our attempt to help might not be the approach that is landing well for the child.
Yes, absolutely. I think there are things we can do that are more helpful than others. And but it's really important to know it's not parents' fault. And I think there's so much guilt associated with that.
Yeah. And especially when it comes to, nourishing and feeding our children, we just want the best for them. And it can feel quite concerning when we see our child is just eating 5 different foods. And we know 5 a day, 5 different types of vegetables and fruits, not too much meat, not too much sugar, not too much salt. There are all these guidelines out there that confuse us and nag on our confidence. I cannot make my child eat this. Like, what's wrong with me? So what would you tell a parent who comes to you and says they have a bad nutrition? Like, I'm so worried they might get sick. They don't have enough vitamins. I'm just so afraid that they don't grow and they cannot thrive with that nutrition.
So, first thing I would say to any parent who is really concerned about that actual nutrition, how many calories are they getting? How many micronutrients are they getting? How many nutrients are they getting? My first recommendation to any parent really struggling with that is to meet with a professional. So I'm not sure what it is in every country. Here where I am, that's going to be a dietitian, and they are going to look at, and here it's also different, a dietitian and a nutritionist. So you're looking for a registered dietitian here where I am. I'm in America, I'm in Florida, and they're going to actually look at those nutrients. They're going to look at those calories, and they're going to say, yeah, maybe they're not eating as much variety as we'd like, but they're getting enough. Or they're going to say, we're lacking here. We need some supplementation here. This is what we can do. Once you do that, that actually gives us a lot more freedom to go forward with trying new things. So we first kind of need to know where a child is nutritionally before we start to take new steps forward. Once we do that, my best recommendation to parents is when we're introducing a new food, to make it fun. And I know that sounds, the first thing when I say make it fun, that sounds fun to me. It sounds fun to your child. A parent is hearing, oh God, that's a lot of work.
Yes, because we don't immediately think of fun and play when we want to teach something, when we want to create a new good habit. And that is the language that our child speaks. Like
that
is just the gateway. That is the communication. You cannot pressure your child and be loud and frightening and expect that they go like, oh yeah, mommy, of course I love broccoli now, all of a sudden, because you're so loud and scary. So yeah, play.
Exactly.
I love that angle, and I love that you can actually use that for, like just maybe decreasing the obstacle or the hurdle of trying. That's something that a lot of parents can probably relate to. It like you cannot force that broccoli into your child's mouth. You just can't. You have nothing that you can do.
Yeah.
But
and the research has actually shown that a child is going to protect their body first.
Yeah.
Their sensory system can't handle it. They're going to protect their body first. And so you cannot physically force them to eat it. And even if you have, so some parents will say, oh, but I have gotten them to take a bite. I have pressured them and they've done it. But the question is, what are they truly learning there? Are they learning to take a bite of food because their body tells them to, and because they're going to enjoy it and want to try new foods? Or did they take a bite of food purely to make you happy? And did they not really learn in that process?
Yeah. So how do you make food fun?
So I want to go back to, it seems like a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be. So fun, and you kind of mentioned this is the best way for kids to learn. So kids learn through play. And we don't always think about that when we think about learning, because we think about school, but even in school, they make learning fun. They learn now with writing letters through like sprinkles, and they learn to count by like doing jumping jacks. So we learn in fun ways, and the table shouldn't be any different. And so what this is going to look like is really going to depend on your child. So if I'm working with a kid who likes cars, and I want them to take that broccoli and explore it, I'm going to say, look at my car. Look how fast my car can go. I can drive my car all the way up to my head. Now they've touched that broccoli, they've driven it across the table, they've put it up, it's near their face and their mouth. And we're going to use what a child likes, what a child enjoys, to get them to be more open to a food, more exploratory of a food, without it being this really scary thing.
I grew up hearing, don't play with food. We don't play with food. How does one get rid of that and just put the broccoli in the car and and literally play with it?
So it's different for every family. Some parents are more hesitant with that, and they don't feel great because of how they were brought up. And so what I tell them is to start small. So how do we start? We don't want to start with something huge. And I always recommend, before you start playing with food for kids, to set boundaries around it. So yes, if you give them a free for all, it is going to be a free-for-all. It is going to be throwing the food, dropping the food. It's going to run around. They're going to drive it to the living room. So one of the first things I recommend teaching a kid is food stays on the table.
Yeah.
It does not leave this table. And it doesn't have to be super messy, and it doesn't have to be super big. It could literally be for a parent who's maybe more hesitant about that. Like, oh, let's take a look at our broccoli. This broccoli looks like a tree. Now, you didn't make a mess. You didn't play with it. You didn't, do this big thing, but it is playful. So instead of saying take a bite, we're starting to encourage them to look at it in a new and different way. So for a parent who's more hesitant, I recommend kind of starting there and talking about the food, maybe just like picking it up with your hands and looking at it, maybe doing something little and small. And then if they feel more confident about that play, when they see how their child responds, to build from there.
That just reminds me, when you say touch the food, pick up the food, look at the food, of baby-led weaning. Do you see any connection between kids who, or families who do baby-led weaning, and eating behavior as a toddler or even later?
So personally, I have not seen that baby-led weaning or feeding your child purees, anything like that directly leads to eating difficulties. What we see instead is that there's, again, something inside your child's body. So a lot of the time I work with kids with sensory processing issues. So whether or not their parents did baby-led weaning or they did purees, their child has sensory processing challenges that's holding them back. So I think a lot of parents worry about which one to do.
Yeah.
Personally, as an occupational therapist, I look at development. So I do really like incorporating some of those purees at times, because it also teaches them a different texture. And so I want that texture getting in there. I want them to learn to close their lips around a spoon. But when it comes to us and when it comes to OT, and in my personal business, I actually don't offer occupational therapy. I am an occupational therapist in my background. But when it comes to that, we actually look at what families want to do for themselves. So I don't tell parents which kind of method they should use when it comes to feeding, but how can I fit this into your methodology? How can I kind of help you with this?
What are sensory processing issues?
Yeah, so I'll start with our 5 senses that everybody knows about in school. So we have our vision, our taste, our smell, our hearing, and our touch. And that's what everybody thinks about as our 5 senses. We also have another 3 senses that nobody talks about. And that's called our proprioceptive sense, which is our sense of body awareness. So where our arms are, where our head is. Our vestibular sense, which is our sense of head movement. So our vestibular sense actually comes from our inner ear, and the fluid shifts back and forth. And that's how we know if we're moving or if we're staying still. And then we have our interoceptive sense, which is our sense of our body signals. So our emotions, when our tummy hurts, when you feel nauseous. And so sensory processing difficulties is when our body is not interpreting and responding to these senses appropriately. So a child may touch a broccoli and all of a sudden they get this, oh no signal, and they're like upset because their hands are dirty and it feels weird and it feels overwhelming. And that's actually a message that was sent immediately to their brain telling them, oh no, this is dangerous or this is threatening.
I've never thought of that before, how a child would feel by, touching something that feels odd and doesn't feel safe ultimately. So my son doesn't like to have his hands dirty at dinner. He doesn't like to eat with his hands, and he doesn't like mushy things. He would not eat a banana or guacamole. Would you say this is already a sensory processing difficulty that he has, or how do you draw the line between just something like personality trait or something a child comes with and something that you can actually work with and feel like, okay, I would really like to support you in that, because I think it's important that you are comfortable with that?
Yeah. So I should say, of course, anything I say on here is not medical advice or therapy advice for anybody listening. But when it comes to where do we consider it a difficulty or a challenge is when it impacts life.
Mm.
So we all have sensory challenges. I don't like saran wrap, so I don't use it. But if somebody put it, I could, but I wouldn't particularly enjoy it. It gives me goosebumps.
Mm.
But a child with sensory processing difficulties, or even an adult with sensory processing difficulties, they cannot finish their day. They cannot eat. They cannot handle that and
Mm.
keep going through their day. And that's when we call it a difficulty. And so it's actually really interesting because these children are often seen as, stubborn,
Mm.
controlling, but it's actually very normal for a child with sensory processing challenges to be a little bit more wanting their environment to be controlled because it feels more predictable
Mm.
and it lets them know what's coming versus when they don't control that and all of a sudden a banana ends up on their plate and they are, being bribed or pressured to eat it, they feel uncomfortable and so they push back.
Yeah. What would you recommend a parent how to kind of start this conversation of maybe we have here a child that needs different support than what we can give, and is it actually already a difficulty, or is it just my child? Where does a parent start?
I would say a parent's best place to start if you are seeing sensory processing challenges is to go to your pediatrician, your doctor, and ask for an occupational therapy script. So, an occupational therapist is actually going to go with you, go through this step by step. And they're going to go through all 8 senses and how it affects their life, how it affects your every single day life, and consider whether or not this is a challenge. Now, I will say again, I don't know how it is in different countries. Here in America, we have something called sensory processing disorder. And so a lot of parents are concerned with, is it a disorder? Is it not?
Yeah.
For us, it's actually it's a little controversial. We have something called the DSM-5, which is our kind of book of diagnoses, and it's not included in that right now. So right now, that is not a standalone diagnosis at all. It's an add-on diagnosis to, something like autism, something like another kind of diagnosis. So as an OT, we actually don't diagnose. We only say, oh, that they're having a challenge here. And so the person who is going to diagnose that is going to be more of like your pediatrician.
Okay. Yeah, that was a big question mark for me when this topic of sensory processing difficulties came up. Now that I'm a parent coach, people ask me about this. I live here in Europe. That's not a thing here. Like it's not even something that I would even know how to support my child. I would not even know where to start looking here for that. And I know that there are kids who just have difficulties keeping their socks on because they just cannot stand or handle that sensation of having socks on.
Absolutely.
And these kids here usually are just stubborn kids, as you said, where, and it has nothing to do even with eating, but I can see that there is a pattern that you can see when you look at your child, and when you look beyond the behavior, beyond how they set their boundary of, how they feel about their body and their senses, that knowing these things and becoming aware that there might be something else, then most likely it's not just stubbornness. There's a reason behind that, why they're not eating certain foods, why they're not comfortable staying seated at the table with you, or why they just don't like to keep their socks on. And if it is a challenge in everyday life because they cannot go to school, or they cannot attend sports class, or they don't eat in the canteen, or whatever it is, then it really becomes a struggle. So I love that you pointed this out about, that it's not a diagnosis, but it is. You guys are already very aware of that. I think here in Europe we still have some work to do on that.
Yeah. And that's so frustrating. It's so frustrating that those resources aren't available to you guys. I will say I do have a podcast coming out soon, a podcast episode in March. It's going to be called Sensory 101. So any parent who feels like they just need a start to sensory, it's a great start. There's also a book called The Out of Sync Child. It's a little bit of it's not the most easy read. It's a little bit of a technical read, but it is a great one. It goes through all the senses. So a parent who doesn't have the support and doesn't have the resources for that, that's a really good start. And I think there's one more, The Sensational Child. And that's another really great book for a parent who's just wanting to start to get into this and understand whether or not this might be something to look into.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's already a great help for the beginning when you're just feeling kind of lost and don't know how, where to put this behavior. One thing I wanted to ask you, Samantha, is about meal times and the time that kids actually can spend at the table. I know that a lot of parents struggle with, they come and they eat in 2 minutes and then they're gone. And I want them to sit. I want to talk about your day. I want to connect with you, but they are just gone.
Yeah. So my first question for everybody out there is, when this is happening, are they coming to the table and the table is not a pleasant place? So are they running away from the table to protect themselves because they know that they are coming in for a fight? Because if we know we're going somewhere unpleasant, I am going to spend as little time as possible there. So the very first thing is to make the table a pleasant place, kind of how we talked about. And you mentioned that pressuring. I am actually not the biggest fan of pressuring your child to take a bite of anything. When it comes to it, I want kids to take a bite because they want to. Now, this takes some work. And again, if you've chatted with a dietitian and you know that we have enough nutritional needs being met, we have a little bit more wiggle room there. But number one, I want to make the table a nice place for them to be, because if we can't, they're not going to stay there. Number two is, why are they getting up to run? So if it's not that, my next question is, are they getting up because of their sensory system? So are they having a hard time staying seated? So that goes back to that vestibular sense that I mentioned, that sense of movement. Some kids, their vestibular sense needs more movement, and it actually makes it physically challenging for them to stay seated. And so they need to move, they need to go. Now, if we're looking at a toddler is going to get up and they are going to run. And so I should mention here, parents of toddlers might be sitting here thinking, oh my God, my child has a vestibular concern. Some may, but most toddlers are going to get up and run from the table. So have a little leeway with that there. But maximize that time at the table, make it pleasant, make it engaging. If you're playing at the table, they're going to be more likely to stay because it's fun. And the other thing I actually really like to do is a timer. So I am a fan of timers. I am a fan of setting boundaries around, we're going to sit for this many minutes. Now, with a child, we're not going to go from I sit for 2 minutes to I sit for 30 minutes. It's going to be, okay, today we're going to sit for 3 minutes. You don't have to do this if you're not ready to. I'm not forcing them to take a bite of a new food if they're not ready to. But we do need to sit and chat. And when that timer goes off, you can go. And we build up from there. So we start at 2 minutes, then 3 minutes, then 4. And again, we make that pleasant. Those 4 minutes should not be a fight. We want those 4 minutes to be a fun 4 minutes.
Yeah, that fun is, again, I think, a big challenge. And when I think of dinner time, when we have small kids, and as you say, they just do toddler things and they just run around. It's just so stressful. It just doesn't seem fun. How can a parent enter in that? Let's make this fun. Like, do you have a few, practical tips that a parent can start tomorrow?
Yeah. So I think the first one is realizing, just as the parent, it's not your job to get them to eat. It's your job to provide them with the opportunities to do so. And I think that just is like a relief in itself.
It is. Like, you saying that, I immediately think, oh my God, like, I don't have that burden on my shoulder that they eat. I don't have to make them eat. I just have to put it there.
Yeah, we just have to put it there. It is your job to make sure they have a food they can eat. So we want to make sure that they have like a safe food on their plate, something they can predictably eat and fill up on, along with new foods that we are introducing. But it is not your job to force them to take a bite of a food. And so I think even just that allows a parent to be like, oh, I can sit at the table, I can eat my own dinner, I can focus on my meal and talk to my kid, versus we now sit at the table and it immediately is on my mind and immediately on their mind, take a bite, take a bite, take a bite. So I think that's the first thing, is that practical thing. If you leave here today, just, it is not your job to get them to eat. It is your job to provide them with the opportunities to do so and to help them learn.
Yeah.
And once you're sitting there, once you kind of get with that, then that next step is, again, when we talk about making it fun, it doesn't have to be this big, you don't have to put on a show, but making it fun is talking to your child, talking about something that is not their food and not their difficulty eating food, but about something enjoyable. Talk about what they did at school today. And I know, don't ask what they did at school because it's going to be nothing. But talk about what they did, or how good they did coming to the table, and wow, you're sitting up so well. And I do like to say, I don't like to praise a child for taking a bite of a food and, oh, you did that and I'm so happy as a parent. But we also want to acknowledge when they do things. So when they come to the table, like, oh, you came to the table and you're sitting here, as opposed to, oh, you came to the table and it made me as a parent happy.
Yeah.
So wanting those kids to get that internal drive to do things. Sorry, that was a little tangent, but how to make it fun. Talk to them, have enjoyment with them. What makes mealtime fun for you? Talk to your partner, your spouse. Just enjoy it yourself. And that kind of rubs off on your kid too.
Yeah. What if the partner is not on board with the same philosophy as you?
Oh my gosh, I would say that is like 95% of the time when I start to talk with the parent. Yes, there's almost always one partner is on board and the other partner doesn't even think there's usually a problem. They're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. They eat fine for me. And it's usually the person who's feeding the child more often is the one who is like, no, there's something going on. This isn't working. I've done my research.
Yeah.
So I will say it's important for your partner and you to be on the same page. So, but usually the step in that middle that's not there is the education. So they are not on board because they don't know as much. And sometimes they don't sit down to learn it as much as you have. So you're on board because you've learned all this stuff. They're not there yet. And so we need to present them with the resources that will help them understand why you're doing what you're doing.
I love that it's not taking out on a personal level, but really on the information and knowledge level, and to bring them on board with that, with the evidence, and not making it a big marriage problem. Or
yeah, usually when I talk to a parent, I'll say like, bring your spouse, like let's talk to your spouse and let's talk about it all together. Because when we do, you kind of get both on board, versus when you only talk to one person, they have to go back and explain it. And so your spouse doesn't really ever get that chance to ask their questions and to get educated on what they are. So whatever you're learning from, whatever you're listening to, send it to your spouse, have them listen to it. If they won't, that's a little bit more challenging. And that's when I would say to book an appointment with somebody so you guys can talk with them and all kind of get on the same page.
That's amazing advice. That's really, really helpful. Samantha, tell us how you work with people and what you do.
Yeah. So I have two offerings right now. I have a Food Explorers membership, which is where I teach parents how to help their child explore new foods in a fun way with minimal time. So with this one, this is a monthly membership, and every single month you get a food exploration activity. So you don't have to do any of that thinking. You don't have to do any of that planning. It's just ready for you. You get a quick tips guide. So every month we pick a different theme. So this month in the membership, we're talking all about fruits, what makes fruits hard. And it's just a quick tips guide in how to do it, what I think is challenging about it, where to go first. We do a coffee chat. So every month we have a live meetup where parents come and talk about our struggles and we problem solve together. And then the last one that we have is, I'm blanking right now. There's one more part in that. A food exploration activity, a quick tips guide. Oh, and grocery list and recipes. So I actually do the work of finding fun groceries in the grocery store that are good for children with feeding challenges, and a new recipe that I think would be good for a child with feeding challenges. And I explain why for these things. So with the Food Explorers membership, I do the work for you. All you have to do is implement it. And then my next one is my Making Sense of Eating course, and that is all things sensory. So that is going to go through each and every sensory system, break it down so a parent really understands what it is, because the sensory, it feels really intimidating and it feels like a whole new different world that you don't even know about. So I break it down into terms that parents really understand and can apply back to their child. So my goal, this is a course. My goal in this course is for parents to leave there feeling like they have a master's degree in their child's sensory system. And so you leave and you're like, I get my child's sensory system now. And so those are my two offerings for parents. The first is the monthly membership, and the second is the sensory course.
I love how comprehensive that is. And especially the membership one, I imagine it taking so much of the mental overwhelm and burden of planning, of figuring things out, of finding new ideas, of constantly researching of how else could I do this. I think that's amazing. That's really, really helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. We actually have core trainings in there too. So there, if you are somebody who likes to learn, there's also trainings about how to set up your table and how to set up kind of that base work, groundwork level to help your child succeed.
It sounds achievable. Like I feel if I would have a child, I used to have, but things are much better at the table now. But we're just talking to you, just gives me so much hope. And I hope, guys, that you enjoy this episode. And if you want, and I'm sure you know someone who can benefit from Samantha's work, there is so much evidence, there is so much support. It's a whole community. It's not just dumping stuff on you. So just imagining going on a coffee chat and, you know, engaging with others. I think that's super nice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I hope everybody found this really valuable. And if you guys have any questions, let Stephanie know.
I will put all your links in the show notes of this episode. And I see you next time at Raw and Real with Stephanie Fernandez. Thanks and bye.